The microphone crackled once in his hand before his voice filled the entire cathedral, smug and rehearsed, the sound bouncing off 200 years of stone and stained glass. What would you do if the man standing across from you at the altar, in front of everyone who mattered to both your lives, lowered the microphone from the officiant, laughed, and announced that he refused to throw his future away on a broke schoolteacher? What would you do if he pointed toward the front pew, toward another woman dripping in diamonds she had not earned, and declared that his company needed real power, not you? Amara Bellwether stood in her simple wedding gown. No expensive lace, no elaborate beading, just clean ivory silk that smelled faintly of chalk dust and vanilla from the classroom she had left only hours earlier. And she did not cry. She simply watched, her spine straight, her expression carved from something far colder than heartbreak, while Julian Hargrove grinned into that microphone like a man who believed he had just won something. None of them, not Julian, not the woman now climbing the altar steps in a vibrant red dress, entirely inappropriate for a wedding, had the faintest idea that in exactly 5 minutes, the stained glass windows above their heads would begin trembling with the sound of an approaching army, and both of their precious companies would cease to exist before the sun set that evening. To understand how Amara Bellwether ended up standing at that altar, absorbing a public betrayal with a composure that terrified everyone watching, we must return 2 years earlier to a modest, sunlit classroom on the second floor of Ashford Elementary School, where a woman calling herself Amara Bellwether taught third-grade science, spending her afternoons helping children build volcano models out of baking soda and vinegar, and driving home each evening in a second-hand hatchback that rattled slightly whenever she braked too quickly. Nobody at that school, not the principal, not her fellow teachers, not a single parent who greeted her warmly during pickup, had any idea that the quiet, patient woman grading spelling tests at her desk was, in fact, Her Imperial Highness, Princess Amara Draganov, sole heir to the Draganov sovereign empire, a dynasty whose banking holdings, industrial conglomerates, and sovereign investment funds spanned 4 continents and exceeded, by conservative estimate, well over $3 trillion in total value. She had grown up inside a palace of marble and gold, surrounded from childhood by tutors, guards, and advisors who reminded her constantly that every friendship she formed, every smile she offered a stranger, carried the invisible weight of political calculation and dynastic obligation. By the time she turned 26, Amara had grown suffocated by a life where no one, absolutely no one, had ever looked at her without first calculating the political and financial value of her bloodline. Her father, Emperor Vasilios Draganov, a formidable man whose chest carried decades of hard-earned medals and whose reputation for ruthless business acumen was matched only by his fierce protectiveness over his only daughter, had reluctantly granted her request for an extended sabbatical from public duties, transferring interim ceremonial responsibilities to a trusted cousin, while Amara disappeared into an entirely fabricated identity. She wanted, more than anything, to discover whether a man could ever love her simply because she was Amara, without the crushing weight of an empire distorting his every decision. It was during this fragile, hopeful chapter of self-discovery that she met Julian Hargrove, a technology entrepreneur in the early, uncertain stages of building his own startup, a man whose charm and apparent humility initially convinced her she had finally found what she was searching for. In those early days, Julian seemed wonderfully earnest, arriving to their first few dates in a modest sedan with a cracked side mirror, talking passionately about his vision for a logistics software platform he believed could revolutionize small business supply chains, always careful to mention how much he admired people who worked with children, who chose meaning over money. He took Amara to inexpensive noodle shops tucked into strip malls, brought her secondhand books he thought she might enjoy, and told her one evening, sitting on a park bench beneath a canopy of autumn leaves, that he did not care that she was just a teacher, that her kindness and intelligence were worth more to him than any inheritance could ever be. Amara, starved for exactly this kind of uncomplicated affection, allowed herself to fall completely, believing she had finally found a man who valued her heart over any fortune, hidden or otherwise. For nearly a year, their relationship felt like the truest happiness she had ever known, built on modest dinners and quiet evenings, and a shared dream of an ordinary life. Neither of them, in her case at least, had ever actually been permitted to live. The shift began slowly, almost imperceptibly, around the point when Julian's startup began attracting serious venture capital interest, and with it, an entirely new circle of investors, advisors, and ambitious business partners who measured every relationship in terms of leverage and access. It was during this period that Victoria Ashworth entered their lives, introduced to Julian through a mutual business contact as the lead investor prepared to fund his company's critical next funding round with an investment exceeding $40 million. Victoria was nearly a decade older than Amara, a striking woman with an unmistakable air of practiced entitlement, always dressed in the boldest, most attention-demanding designer pieces available. Her perfume so aggressively floral, it seemed to announce her presence in a room before she had even entered it. From their very first meeting at a fundraising dinner, Julian insisted Amara attend. Victoria's eyes had swept over Amara's simple department store dress with an expression of theatrical, barely concealed disdain. "So you're the school teacher," Victoria had said that evening, swirling champagne in a glass so delicate it seemed almost cruel in her grip, her tone carrying that particular brand of condescension reserved exclusively for people wealthy investors consider entirely beneath meaningful conversation. How refreshing. I always find it fascinating when ambitious men date so far outside their professional circle. It really shows character, doesn't it? Choosing someone so grounded. The word grounded had landed like a precisely aimed insult, and Amara had simply smiled, years of diplomatic instinct, allowing her to absorb the blow without visible reaction, though internally, something cold had already begun settling into her chest, a warning she chose, for the sake of the relationship she still believed in, to ignore. The microaggressions multiplied steadily over the following months as Victoria's financial involvement in Julian's company deepened. At a company launch event, Victoria loudly asked Amara, in front of a cluster of Julian's investors, whether she had ever considered a career with more meaningful earning potential, her voice pitched deliberately loud enough to ensure the humiliation landed publicly. At a private dinner celebrating a successful funding milestone, Victoria arrived wearing a diamond necklace that likely cost more than Amara's entire 5-year teaching salary combined, making a point of describing its provenance and value in exhaustive detail, while Amara sat quietly, feeling smaller with every passing syllable. At another gathering, someone left an anonymous printed pamphlet about career advancement seminars tucked into Amara's coat pocket, a cruelty she never confirmed the source of, but suspected, with cold certainty, exactly whose perfume it likely carried. Julian, rather than defending Amara against Victoria's escalating cruelty, began quietly asking her to simply tolerate it for the sake of his company's future. "Victoria's investment is everything right now," he explained one night, avoiding her eyes as he said it, his voice carrying the particular impatience of a man who had already decided which battles mattered to him and which did not. "Can you just be a little more understanding? We need her capital if this company is ever going to succeed." Amara, still clinging to the fragile hope that the man who once brought her second-hand books on park benches might eventually rediscover his integrity, agreed each time, swallowing insult after insult, telling herself that patience would eventually be rewarded with loyalty. She had no idea, during those long months of quiet endurance, exactly how deep Julian's late-night meetings with Victoria had already become, nor how completely his priorities had shifted away from anything resembling the man she had originally fallen in love with. Wedding planning proceeded despite the mounting tension, Amara insisting on paying for the modest ceremony herself, using her teaching salary and savings, refusing Julian's occasional half-hearted offers to involve investor connections, wanting desperately to prove that their marriage could be built on something genuine rather than financial convenience. She chose a modest but beautiful cathedral downtown, selected flowers from a small local florist, and spent weeks hand-addressing invitations to the handful of close friends and colleagues who represented her entire chosen family in this anonymous life she had built. She had no idea, walking down that aisle in her simple ivory gown, exactly how thoroughly Julian's ambitions had already consumed whatever affection had once existed between them. The morning of the wedding arrived crisp and golden, autumn light streaming through the cathedral's magnificent stained glass window, casting fractured patterns of color across the stone floor, where nearly 300 guests gathered in their finest clothes. Amara stood in the small preparation room, her heart pounding with a mixture of nervous anticipation and a persistent unease she could not fully name, unaware that in the front pew, Victoria Ashworth sat waiting in a shocking, inappropriate red dress, diamonds glittering at her throat, a small, satisfied smile playing at the corners of her painted lips, as though she alone possessed knowledge of exactly how this ceremony would conclude. The processional music began, and Amara walked down the aisle, her bouquet of simple white daisies trembling slightly in her hands, reaching the altar, where Julian waited in a suit that appeared expensive, but upon closer inspection, carried the subtle telltale signs of a rental. Seams slightly too loose, the fit not quite tailored to his frame. She searched his face for the warmth she remembered from their earliest months together, and found instead something strange and calculating behind his eyes, a nervous energy that had nothing to do with typical wedding day emotion. The officiant began the ceremony, his voice warm and measured, moving through traditional opening remarks, while nearly 300 guests settled into respectful silence, sunlight filtering through stained glass in soft, colored patterns across the stone floor. It happened during the exchange of vows, right as the officiant turned to Julian and asked him to begin speaking. Instead of reciting his vows, Julian lowered the microphone slightly, a strange, theatrical smile spreading across his face as he turned to address the assembled guests rather than his bride. A confused murmur rippled through the cathedral, guests exchanging uncertain glances, unsure whether this constituted some unconventional but ultimately harmless departure from tradition. Amara felt her stomach drop, a cold, sinking certainty settling over her as she watched Julian's expression shift into something she had never seen directed at her before, something dismissive and cruel. "I want to say something before we continue," Julian announced, his voice amplified through the cathedral's excellent sound system, carrying easily to every corner of the vast stone space. "Amara is a wonderful woman. Really, she is. Kind, patient, everything a school teacher should be." He paused, letting the word school teacher hang in the air with deliberate, humiliating emphasis, as though the profession itself were somehow shameful. "But the truth is, I'm not going to throw my life away on a broke school teacher when my company needs real power behind it." A collective gasp rippled through the cathedral, followed by an uncomfortable, disbelieving silence. 300 guests frozen in their pews, unsure whether they were witnessing an elaborate joke or something far more genuinely cruel. Amara stood perfectly still at the altar, her bouquet clutched tightly in hands that had stopped trembling entirely, replaced instead by an unnatural, glacial stillness that seemed to radiate from somewhere deep inside her chest. She did not cry. She did not gasp. She simply stood there, absorbing the full weight of the humiliation being broadcast across the entire cathedral, her expression carefully, deliberately blank, the same composed mask she had been trained since childhood to wear during moments of extreme provocation. Julian, apparently emboldened by her silence, which he mistook for shock, rather than the controlled calm of someone who had survived far worse humiliations in windowless negotiation rooms with hostile foreign dignitaries, turned and gestured dramatically toward the front pew. "My company needs someone who understands real power," he announced, his voice ringing with theatrical triumph. "Someone who can actually elevate what we're building." He extended his hand toward Victoria, who rose gracefully from her seat, her shocking red dress catching the light streaming through the stained glass windows, her diamond necklace glittering with obscene brilliance as she made her way toward the altar, with the unhurried confidence of a woman who believed herself utterly untouchable. A ripple of scandalized whispers moved through the guests, some pressing hands to their mouths in shock, others, unforgivably, beginning to laugh, a low, cruel murmur of amusement rising from certain corners of the cathedral where Julian's business associates sat, apparently finding entertainment in the public destruction of a woman they had never bothered getting to know. Victoria climbed the altar steps and wrapped her arm possessively around Julian's, turning to face Amara with an expression of pure, undisguised satisfaction, her diamonds catching the light with theatrical precision as she tilted her chin upward. "I do apologize for the timing," she said, her voice carrying easily through the cathedral's excellent acoustics, dripping with false sympathy that fooled absolutely no one. "But surely you understand. Men building empires need partners who can actually contribute something meaningful, not modest little salaries and modest little dreams." The word meaningful landed like a slap, delivered with the casual cruelty of a woman who had spent her entire life believing that money conferred not just privilege, but moral superiority over anyone who possessed less of it. Amara stood motionless at the altar, absorbing wave after wave of public humiliation, her chin lifted slightly, her spine straight, her expression revealing absolutely nothing of the storm building beneath her composed exterior. She thought, in that suspended, endless moment, of every sacrifice she had made over the past 2 years, every insult swallowed for Julian's ambition, every moment of anonymity chosen specifically to discover whether love could exist without the complications of her birthright. She thought of her father's voice, delivered the night before she left the palace nearly 2 years earlier, his weathered hand resting heavily on her shoulder as he told her that some people would reveal their true character only when they believed no consequences existed for their cruelty. She understood now, standing in that cathedral, absorbing insults from a mistress dripping in diamonds and a fiancé who had just humiliated her in front of 300 witnesses, that today was exactly the day her father had warned her about. Without a single word, without a flicker of visible distress, Amara reached into the small clutch, tucked discreetly into her bouquet, her fingers steady and precise, despite the chaos of the moment, and withdrew a slim, unmarked device that resembled an ordinary compact mirror but concealed a single embedded signal button beneath its polished surface. She pressed it firmly once, her eyes never leaving Julian's face, watching his triumphant smile begin to falter slightly as he registered, for the first time, the complete absence of fear or devastation in her expression. Somewhere across the ocean, deep within the fortified communications center of the Dragonov Imperial Palace, an alert system that had remained dormant for nearly 2 years, suddenly activated, and a duty officer, specifically trained for this exact contingency, immediately notified the Emperor's personal security detail, already stationed discreetly within a 10-mile radius of the cathedral, as a standard precaution that Amara had never bothered mentioning to Julian. For several long seconds, nothing happened, and the cathedral remained suspended in its uncomfortable silence, guests exchanging uncertain glances, unsure whether the ceremony had concluded or whether some further humiliation awaited. Then, faintly at first, a new sound began infiltrating the cathedral's heavy stone walls, a rhythmic, mechanical cadence that grew steadily louder, the unmistakable sound of disciplined marching boots striking pavement in perfect unison. accompanied by the low, powerful rumble of heavy vehicle engines approaching from multiple directions simultaneously. The stained glass windows above the altar began to tremble faintly, colored light rippling across the stone floor with each vibration, and Julian's triumphant expression flickered into confusion, his eyes darting toward the cathedral's heavy wooden doors, while Victoria's manicured hand instinctively tightened around his arm, her earlier confidence visibly cracking at the edges. The massive doors at the rear of the cathedral swung open with theatrical, deliberate force, and autumn sunlight poured through the opening, silhouetting the imposing figures now filling the entrance. Dozens of soldiers in full ceremonial imperial uniform, gold braiding catching the light, rifles held with the precise discipline of men who had trained their entire lives for exactly this kind of formal procession. They marched down the center aisle in perfect formation, boots striking the stone floor with thunderous, synchronized precision, guests scrambling out of their pews in stunned confusion as the soldiers passed, their expressions caught somewhere between terror and disbelieving fascination. Behind this formidable procession walked a figure whose presence alone seemed to compress the very air within the cathedral, an older man of imposing height and bearing, his chest covered in medals that caught the light with blinding brilliance, his expression carved from granite, utterly devoid of warmth for anyone except the woman standing frozen at the altar. Emperor Vasilios Draganov moved down the aisle with the unhurried, absolute authority of a man who had commanded nations for over 3 decades. His presence alone, silencing every whispered conversation, every nervous cough, every rustle of fine fabric, among the nearly 300 stunned guests, now witnessing the true scale of what they had unknowingly stumbled into. Julian stood frozen at the altar, the microphone slipping from his suddenly limp fingers, clattering against the stone floor with a sharp, echoing crack that seemed unnaturally loud in the otherwise silent cathedral. Victoria's face had drained of all color, her diamonds suddenly seeming garish and small against the overwhelming weight of genuine imperial power now filling the space around her. The emperor climbed the altar steps with measured, deliberate stride, his soldiers forming a protective perimeter around the entire altar area, effectively trapping Julian and Victoria within a circle they could not escape without physically pushing past armed imperial guard. He reached Amara, his granite expression softening instantly, transforming into something achingly tender as he cupped her face gently between his weathered hands and pressed a slow, reverent kiss to her forehead, a gesture so intimate and unguarded that it seemed to belong to an entirely different, private world than the one currently collapsing around Julian and Victoria. "My daughter," he said, his voice carrying easily through the stunned silence of the cathedral, deep and resonant with unmistakable authority. "I told you these people would reveal themselves eventually. I am only sorry it took this long." The word daughter detonated through the cathedral like an explosion. Nearly 300 guests suddenly gasping in unison, the pieces of nearly 2 years of careful deception assembling themselves in real time across their horrified, disbelieving faces. Julian's mouth opened and closed several times without producing sound, his mind clearly struggling to reconcile the modest schoolteacher he had just publicly humiliated with the daughter of an actual reigning emperor now standing before him, flanked by dozens of armed imperial soldiers. Victoria's earlier arrogance had completely evaporated, replaced by a dawning, horrified comprehension that seemed to age her entire face in the span of a few devastating seconds. The emperor turned then, his cold, assessing gaze settling on Victoria with the particular intensity of a predator who had already decided the fate of his prey long before the confrontation began. "You are Victoria Ashworth," he said, not a question, his tone flat and utterly devoid of warmth. "Lead investor of Ashworth Capital Partners and the primary funding source behind Mr. Hargrove's little technology venture." Victoria nodded weakly, apparently unable to summon her voice, her diamonds suddenly looking cheap and desperate against her visibly trembling throat. "What neither of you seem to understand," the Emperor continued, extracting a folded document from an inner pocket of his ceremonial jacket with unhurried precision, "is that Ashworth Capital Partners' primary line of credit, the exact capital funding your investment in Mr. Hargrove's company, flows through a chain of holding institutions ultimately owned and controlled by the Dragonoff Sovereign Wealth Fund." The words landed with devastating finality, and Amara watched with quiet, glacial satisfaction as Victoria's face transformed through a rapid succession of emotions, confusion, disbelief, and finally, horrified understanding. "That's impossible," Victoria whispered, her voice barely audible even in the cathedral's perfect acoustics. "My fund, my investors, my entire portfolio has always operated with capital ultimately traceable back to my empire," the Emperor interrupted, his voice carrying the absolute, unshakable authority of a man who had never once in his life needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. "As of 6 o'clock this morning, following notification of tonight's ceremony, I ordered a full audit and immediate freeze on every credit line and investment vehicle connected to your fund, along with every subsidiary account belonging to Mr. Hargrove's company. Both of your empires, gentlemen and ladies, ceased meaningful financial operation approximately 4 hours ago." Julian's knees seemed to buckle slightly, one hand reaching out to grip the altar rail for support, his rented suit suddenly seeming to hang even more loosely off his trembling frame. "That can't be right," he stammered, his voice cracking with rising panic. "We closed our funding round 2 weeks ago. The money is already in our accounts. You can't just—" "I can," the Emperor interrupted, his tone carrying no trace of mercy. "And I already have. Every wire transfer connected to your company's accounts has been reversed under Emergency Sovereign Banking Authority. Every credit line extended to Miss Ashworth's fund has been called due immediately, in full, an amount I suspect neither of you currently possesses the liquidity to satisfy." He paused, letting the devastating silence stretch across the cathedral before continuing. "Your companies, both of them, will file for bankruptcy protection within the week. I imagine the financial press will find the timing rather remarkable." Victoria sank slowly to her knees on the altar's marble platform, her shocking red dress pooling around her like spilled wine, her diamonds suddenly seeming to mock her with their continued, indifferent brilliance against skin that had gone pale and clammy with genuine terror. "Please," she whispered, tears finally beginning to streak down her perfectly made-up face. "There has to be some arrangement, some negotiation. I have relationships, connections." "You had connections," the Emperor corrected coldly. "Every one of them existed because my empire allowed your fund to operate within its financial ecosystem. That arrangement concluded the moment you chose to humiliate my daughter in front of 300 witnesses." Julian, apparently finally processing the complete, catastrophic scope of what was unfolding, turned desperately toward Amara, his earlier arrogant confidence completely shattered, replaced by pure, undignified panic. "Amara, please," he stammered, reaching toward her with a trembling hand that she did not accept. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know who you were. If I had known—" "If you had known," Amara interrupted, her voice cutting through his desperate babbling with a calm, cold precision that silenced him instantly, "you would have treated me exactly the same way you treated every investor and business contact in your life, with calculated interest based entirely on financial value. The only difference is that I would have known from the very beginning exactly what kind of man you truly are." She paused, watching him crumble further under the weight of her words. "You didn't fall in love with a school teacher and then discover ambition, Julian. You were always exactly this person. I simply gave you 2 years to prove it." Julian sank to his knees beside Victoria on the cold marble altar, his rented suit crumpling awkwardly around him, his earlier theatrical confidence completely dissolved into raw, undignified desperation. "Please," he begged, looking up at the emperor with tears now streaming freely down his face. Please, there has to be something, anything. I'll do whatever you ask. The emperor regarded him with an expression of complete, glacial indifference, the look of a man observing something beneath his notice, rather than a fellow human being pleading for mercy. There is nothing you can offer me that I want, Mr. Hargrove, he said simply. You made your choice. The moment you decided humiliating my daughter in front of witnesses was worth whatever you believed Miss Ashworth's investment could provide. I am simply ensuring you understand the full weight of that decision. Amara turned to her father, addressing him with quiet, measured composure, despite the storm of emotion still settling within her chest. Father, she said, I believe we've concluded our business here. The emperor nodded once, extending his arm toward her, which she accepted gracefully, her simple ivory gown catching the light streaming through the stained glass windows as she prepared to descend the altar steps beside him. Behind them, Julian and Victoria remained collapsed on the altar's marble platform, not in supplication, but in the boneless collapse of people whose entire world had just been dismantled in front of an audience of nearly 300 stunned witnesses. Sophia, please, Julian called out, momentarily forgetting even her correct name in his desperate panic. Please, I love you. I made a terrible mistake. Please give me another chance. Amara paused at the top of the altar steps, turning back to look at him one final time, her expression carrying no anger, no lingering hurt, only a vast, quiet emptiness where affection for him used to exist. You don't even remember my name correctly, Julian, she said, her voice calm and devastatingly clear, carrying easily through the silent cathedral. That tells me everything I need to know about how much attention you ever actually paid to who I really was, long before you learned about my father's empire. She turned away from him completely then, walking down the aisle beside her father, flanked by dozens of soldiers whose disciplined formation parted respectfully around them as they moved toward the cathedral's grand entrance and the fleet of armored vehicles waiting beyond it. Outside, the autumn sunlight illuminated a procession of gleaming black vehicles bearing the imperial crest, engines idling in perfect formation along the cathedral's front drive, dozens of additional soldiers standing at rigid attention beside them. Amara paused at the top of the cathedral steps, taking a final, deliberate breath of crisp autumn air, feeling the enormous weight of nearly 2 years of careful deception finally lift from her shoulder entirely. She thought of every insult absorbed, every dismissive comment endured, every quiet humiliation swallowed for the sake of a relationship built on nothing but Julian's calculated ambition and Victoria's casual cruelty. And she felt, for the first time in months, an overwhelming sense of clarity and peace. The following days unfolded with a swift, merciless efficiency that only genuine sovereign power could provide. Julian's company filed for bankruptcy within 4 days, its remaining assets liquidated to satisfy creditors who had extended credit based entirely on financial projections that evaporated the moment the Dragunov Sovereign Wealth Fund withdrew its indirect backing. Victoria's investment fund collapsed even faster, its reputation destroyed beyond any possibility of recovery once word spread through elite financial circles that she had attempted to fund a fraudulent business venture while publicly humiliating the daughter of a reigning emperor. Neither Julian nor Victoria ever recovered their previous professional standing, both disappearing eventually into a financial obscurity far more permanent and unforgiving than the temporary anonymity Amara had voluntarily chosen for herself during her years of quiet observation. Amara returned to the Dragunov Imperial Palace within the month, resuming her full royal responsibilities with a renewed sense of purpose and clarity that had been noticeably absent before her extended period of disguise. She had gone searching for love uncomplicated by her birthright, and had instead discovered something far more valuable, an unshakable certainty regarding her own worth, forged not within palace walls, but standing at an altar absorbing public humiliation with a composure that had ultimately proven more powerful than any fortune Julian or Victoria had ever chased. Months later, addressing a gathering of young diplomats during a formal state function, she was asked whether she regretted her painful experiment with anonymous life among ordinary citizens. She considered the question thoughtfully, then answered with the same quiet, unshakable calm that had once stood perfectly still while an entire cathedral watched her humiliation unfold. I learned that true character reveals itself most honestly in moments when people believe no consequences will follow their cruelty, she said. Julian and Victoria believed a school teacher could be discarded without cost because they assumed real power always announces itself loudly before entering a room. True power doesn't need to shout to be respected. It only needs to remember patiently until the exact moment arrives to remind everyone precisely what they underestimated. And so, dear viewer, that is how an emperor's daughter disguised as a humble schoolteacher walked into a cathedral facing public betrayal and walked out having erased her enemies' entire fortunes within a single afternoon, leaving behind a disgraced mistress, a bankrupt groom, and 300 witnesses who learned, far too late, that the quietest woman in the room is sometimes the one whose father commands an actual empire. What did you think of this masterful revenge? Did Julian and Victoria get exactly what they deserved? If you loved watching arrogant elites lose absolutely everything in a single, devastating afternoon, smash that like button, share this story with your friends, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story of karma, justice, and quiet imperial power finally reclaiming what was always rightfully hers.